This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing stated on it, either by its hosts or any guests, is to be construed as psychological, medical, or legal advice. You are listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. I'm Haley Radke. Today we are talking about something that may feel triggering to many of us. Indeed, both me and my guest had a hard time at different points during this conversation. Today we are talking with an adoptee who is also an adoptive parent. We don't talk about their adopted child's story, but we do talk about the impossibility of legal guardianship in their case. So, as someone who doesn't really know what I feel firmly about this situation, I invite you to come into the gray zone with me. And if you already know, this is going to be a sensitive topic for me, no problem. You are always welcome to skip an episode. Am I being overdramatic? Maybe. Andie Coston is here with us, and today we're talking about how to live in the gray world of both advocating for adoption abolition and or reform, and also the fact that there are children that do need permanence now. How do we look at the systemic upstream problems that cause adoption to exist, and how do we support the most vulnerable in a timely fashion? There are very challenging parts to being an adopted person who also adopts in the adoptee community. And there are moments where an adopted person is the only other human who could understand what their adoptee is going through. Before we get started, I want to invite you personally to join our Patreon adoptee community today over on adopteeson.com/community, which helps support you and also the show to support more adoptees around the world. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Andie Coston. Welcome, Andie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, why don't you start and share a little bit of your story with us?
Okay, so I am an adoptee. I am a domestic. Whenever I say domestic, I know that's our lingo, but I always feel like I'm a cat. That's what always comes to my head.
And I'm not domesticated by any means.
Right.
Right?
I run a feral family. We just moved and I just met some neighbors and they actually have a kid that's also one of our kids' ages. And I was like, these are my children. They're feral. And I was like, oh, so I've just reduced my children to that now. And he was like, great. We love feral children. I was like, fabulous. Anyway, so I am a domestic infant adoptee. My adoption was originally closed. However, I came home with my hospital bracelet on. And so my adoptive parents knew my biological last name. And as it would have it, when I was about, I think 4 or 5, I want to say more towards 4, my mom's dad, so my biological maternal grandfather, moved to my town and started working at the hospital that my dad worked at. And my dad came home and said to my mom, I think I just met Andrea's grandfather. They didn't say anything because they weren't 100% sure. And then 6 months later, my mom moved to town to live with her dad for a couple months. My parents even invited them to church and they came. I was in Sunday school. I did not meet my biological family at that point, which is actually one of my adoptive parents' greatest regrets. We talk about it all the time, but they were just scared. I mean, this was 1986, 87, and there was no support or encouragement for anything like that. But they had been writing letters through the agency back and forth with my mom. And so there was some sort of openness. And then when I was 14, they said, now you can write her letters. And so my mom and I began communicating a very 19th century style through letters. For those of you who don't have we didn't have the internet back then. It was letters only.
I thought you were going to be like, there were these things called paper and pens and stamps.
I had to, yeah. I even purchased my own like specialized paper with my name on top. And that's where it all went, quote unquote, downhill, because I wrote on that special paper. It was like one of those like kits that you could order. I found a coupon for it in the newspapers that come on Saturday. And they had coupons in them and advertisements for things like mom jeans that had elastic waistbands and coupons for ordering specialized paper. So I ordered my own kit, and with my budget, because my parents are Christian and they were into Dave Ramsey, so I had a budget. I had to spend my own money at 14. And I used that to write my mom. And then she put the pieces together and called her parents and said, holy bleep, I know who has Andrea. So we wrote for a couple years. And a couple years later, I did it's like a weekend retreat for Christian teenagers. And on that retreat, one of my biological cousins accidentally signed up for the same retreat. And so she didn't know that I existed until the day before. She was not allowed to introduce herself until Saturday night. So for 24 hours, I had this weird freaking stranger following me around, asking me questions like, what's your boob size? Like very personal questions. What are you into? Are you a theater person? Do you like crafts? Do you know if you're Irish or not? These are legitimate questions she asked me.
Very subtle.
Very subtle, very subtle. And, being a teen, I was like, this is weird. I didn't catch on to subtleties. She was able to tell me that she was my cousin. And then so she was technically the first biological family member I met. Then the next day at the end of the retreat, they do this like, closing ceremony. And we got done. We walked out of the sanctuary and my dad comes up to me and said, do you want to meet your mom? She's here. And so that's how I met my mom. I was ambushed. And again, we've had to have some conversations about how to not introduce your adoptee to their biological parents, because it wasn't just her. The entire family was there. Like people had flown in from like Chicago and the West to meet me. So it was a little overwhelming. I met my dad a year later, and we met at my biological mother's house with just my parents. That was a little bit less stressful. I knew it was coming. It was fine. But yeah, anyway, that's my story. So yeah, now I have a relationship with my dad. We are at opposite ends of the spectrum politically. So there's some relationship there. We'll be seeing him in a couple of weeks. He's the greatest. I love him. He's very accepting, very chill. I take a lot. I take after him more than I do my mom. So we get along much better. My mom and I are no longer communicating, which I now am fine with. Therapy for a while for that, but that's where I'm at.
Okay. There's a lot there. Wow.
Yeah, right. That itself is a podcast, and we're done. It's a wrap.
Wow. Well, I didn't say anything when you said people flew in, but my face was doing a lot of work at that point, but that doesn't help the audio. Yeah. Whew.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a lot.
It was a little much. It was a little much.
So now fast forward, you have gone through school, to become a social worker and therapist. You have 4 children, and you did something that in the community, in the adoptee community, could be deemed controversial.
A little bit.
Let's go there. What did you do?
People don't have opinions about it at all.
No opinions.
I, as an adoptee, adopted.
Mm-hmm.
I like how we both just had to like take a drink after that to like ground ourselves.
Listen, I fully feel like this conversation is going to be triggering also for me. Like, so just so you know. So we're just, hopefully we won't just go activate each other back and forth. But I've shared this before occasionally, but growing up, I always thought I was going to adopt. Like, I thought I owed it. Like, I owed it to the world to pay back, in quotation marks, this good thing that was done for me. All air quotes, please. So did you ever have those thoughts when you were younger?
Oh, for sure. That's how it all started.
Okay.
And I've talked about this on my Instagram. So like this is all out there. I've been as transparent as I can about this. But when I was younger, I knew I wanted to adopt for the same reasons. Like I even verbally said, I want to save the children at points because I'd been saved by such a great family. So I needed to do that for kids out there who didn't have that, which is funny because I was able to recognize that even at that age, and I'm talking like 8, guys, not like in my teens or 20s, like it was always kind of assumed, and maybe other adoptees will understand this. For some reason, it's just like assumed like that's what we're going to do because it was done for us. Because like you said, we owe it. We have to be grateful enough to do exactly what was done to us. But I was able to pick up that not all kids got what I got. And so that's kind of where already I was starting to like lean into like the dissonance of what I have. And that's the thing. I was adopted by the quintessential adoptive parents. I literally was adopted by a doctor and a teacher. Like that's what Georgia Tan would tell people. Like they're a doctor and they're a teacher. Like it's so cliche. And I had a pretty decent adoption besides ambushing me to meet my biological parents. But already I was able to recognize that what I had received, I felt that I had to be grateful for that because other kids didn't get it. So that's what you described is exactly kind of where it started.
Okay, so I'll share part of my story then too. So when my husband and I were, the first few years of our, not first few, maybe 5 years in, I don't know exactly. We went to like foster training classes, and that was sort of the route we were kind of thinking of going. And it was so strange because all the people in the room, like, I was like, this is an interesting bunch of folks, and all the questions. Oh.
This, as a former foster parent, that sums up foster parents so well.
But this is a stereotype, but like so many of the questions were with regards to money and what they were going to get. And I was like, I feel like that is the wrong reason to be here. So that was pretty, the disillusionment was real in that moment. And then when we were considering adoption, we also went to training for that. And so like the full, however many, 2-day, 10-hour something for the first step. And the way they discouraged older child adoption, they just kept pushing for younger and younger. And then like, because of all the trauma. And so if you get an infant, there's less. And if you adopt from, well, I'm in Canada, if you adopt from the United States, like you can get a younger baby and like freshly born, like
freshly born.
I literally sat in those classes and I was just like, wow. So there's all this need, and this was from a Christian adoption agency, of course. There's all this need supposedly for older child adoption, but there's no money in it for them. And so they're pushing you towards using their infant adoption program. And it was just so upsetting. And so that was like the piece of the puzzle that I was like, I don't think this is the right thing. Like, I just do not.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, there's my thing. Now, how about you? Where did you come to it when actually it's terms of things are starting here now?
Yeah, I want to say it's sort of similar. I want to come back to that like commodification piece that you're talking about. It started for us. My husband and I got married. He knew from the beginning that adoption was something I wanted to do. My views were changing a little bit towards, they were moving away from saviorism to I just want to provide a home for, a child in need. But I still wanted to adopt. Then lo and behold, we struggled for 3 years with infertility. And we both knew we wanted children. He comes from a family of 9. Both of my adoptive parents come from very large families too. And so I was like, I'm going to have 6 kids, which now I laugh hysterically at, having only 4. So we knew we wanted a family, and we tried, we did. We knew we also could not afford things beyond natural options because we were still poor, which is really funny because we literally went to a class with a very large Christian organization, Introduction to Adoption. We started filling out the paperwork, and I sat, we were poor. Like, where did I think I was going to get $40,000?
At the time, and now with inflation.
Right.
Where are you going to find 60?
60, even 70. Like, where did I think? But this is, I just want to pause here for a second and say that this is because what I was thinking and the way I approached it was very much because of the social rhetoric that we are taught in the Christian community about adoption. And I can see that now, and I can give myself a little grace for that now, but 1000%, I was still in that Christian way of thinking. And so, long story short, we ended up having 3 children biologically. The doctors are still not sure how, by the way. Because we joke about that all the time. Like, I don't know how you people got here, but here they are. After our second was born, we had a family friend who was fostering, and we went to like the intro class, and we decided this is something we can do. My husband was working full time. I was home with the littles. It's like, I have the capacity to be a foster parent. We have the space. Let's do it. And so that's kind of where things started to change, because at that time we lived in Michigan, and Michigan had just become a trauma state, meaning they were integrating trauma education into their foster care system. And that was changing how they did things. Supposed to. I don't it's supposed to. So part of my story is we were in these classes, and one of the social workers had legitimately just gotten back from a training on trauma with Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And they're like, oh, Heather just came back. Let's have her come in and tell you guys about trauma. Like, this is the new thing, right? And so she walked in and she did this very quick 5-minute rundown on what trauma was and what it does to the brain. I mean, she even got out her hand model. I wish you guys could see me. If you don't know what the hand model is, just Google brain hand trauma. And she showed how, what happens when our lids flip. And something inside me broke. I was listening to this. I'm going to start crying, guys. I'm sitting in a class with 6 other families. This is Northern Michigan. We don't talk about our feelings in Northern Michigan. We go hunting. As she's describing this, something within my soul broke, and I started sobbing uncontrollably. Not just like little crying, with like tears and you're dabbing them away. I mean, like audibly hyperventilating, sobbing. And my husband had to like put his arms around me, and he's like, what's wrong? And I'm like, I can't talk. They had to pause the class. I had to regain myself. And I just simply said, that's me. That's what's wrong with me. And I think it was that moment where everything inside me shifted, where I realized I wasn't saving children. I wasn't helping children. I was tearing apart families like mine had been torn apart. And I was able to sit and feel the trauma that I had been hiding for 27 years. Actually, I think it was like 30, 32 at this point. And I think that's where everything changed. That's where I started coming out of the fog, even though we hate that term. It's the best thing I have to describe it. And so, we still fostered, but our motivation behind it changed. It went from we're here to adopt to we are here to help families stay together. And we were placed with our now child shortly after that. We had fostered several other children who ended up either going into kinship care, or one of them had, one of our children had to move homes for different reasons unrelated to anything, but it was, they ended up being adopted by that family. But anyway, we were placed with the child who's now our child. Fast forward to we are still fostering. How our child came to be with us is not something that I'm going to share. I'm willing to tell you all the details about my own story, but that is our child's story to tell. We ended up adopting through foster care because there was no other option. Our child was going to be placed, and it was either us or someone that we didn't know. If you guys know anything about foster care, you know that they put children up on a website and people can browse the catalog to choose a child. And we did not want that either. And so, yes, we ended up adopting through foster care because there was no other option. I think it's at this point, Haley, I already talked to you before we even started about this, but when this is where I really had to sit with myself. And it was hard because part of me was happy the case was over. Foster care is hard. It is difficult. It is even harder when you are either a former foster youth, a child who's experienced trauma, or an adoptee yourself. You are bearing witness to your own story playing out in a family that you care about. You are bearing witness to the system treating families unfairly, manipulating them, being coercive, intentionally doing harm to foster families in the name of helping children. So it's very difficult. And so I really had to sit with myself, and I came upon, I'd heard this quote before, but I came upon the Desmond Tutu quote. There comes a point where we need to stop pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And this quote's been used a lot in the foster care and adoptive system, that we got to figure out what the root problem is, what's really happening here. And having walked through being a foster parent, having gone through a master's program in social work and learning about policy and learning how these policies came to be and what their intentions really were, I could kind of see where the root of the problem was. And I could see how I started to believe that we don't need to be doing this. This is harmful. Something has to change. But also, there are children who are in the river now. And we have to, I feel like the best way I can describe it is I'm a person who is actively working to figure out what's wrong at the top of the river. That's my job as a social worker. It's in my code of ethics. I need to be doing that. But also, I can't ignore, in both my job as a therapist and my job as a mother, that there are children currently in the river. There are adoptive and foster families suffering right now. And they're raising children who need our help now. And so that's kind of where I've come to in our adopted journey. I wish with everything inside me every single day that there had been a better option. I wish, I don't want to share my child's story, but I wish we had been offered other options like guardianship. Foster care doesn't like guardianship. This system, they will, if you say, I want to choose guardianship, they will fight you and they will tell you all the horror stories of how it's gone wrong to get you to not do that. But we were not even given that as an option. And I've done a couple other podcasts talking about guardianship and all those other options. So I'm not going to get into that. But there's not a day that goes by that I don't sit with the both and the nuances of how much I hate adoption and how much I've gained from it. And how I every day have to make choices for the betterment of my child where I lose. And I'm okay with that because I'm an adoptee. I'm okay with that. But I think that's why I'm so passionately working in this environment, in this community, because I see the top of the river and I can use I can see the top of the river and I'm living in the river and I'm pulling people out of the river all at once. I know people legitimately hate me because I've adopted. I know people who can't follow me, who can't participate in my work, who can't have anything to do with me because it triggers them. And that's okay. I understand it. I have experienced, we know social media and the internet. I've experienced many a bully, many a person who is triggered by me, who says hurtful things. And after a lot of work, I'm able to sit here and say, like, that's okay. It's okay if you're listening to this podcast and you have to turn it off if it triggers something in you. I mean, Haley, you and I were just talking about how it's going to trigger stuff inside of us. It's such a hard topic. It's such a difficult thing.
Well, one of the things I wanted to talk with you about, and I feel like I'm like poking a little bit. So it's so awkward. It's so awkward.
That's okay. That's okay. You can poke it.
So I've had guests come on the show before, and right before we record, they'll be like, oh, and off the record, I'm also an adoptive parent, but don't ask me about that. I don't want to talk about that. And I'm like, oh, okay. And so publicly on their online life, no one knows that they're also an adoptive parent. And I think it's probably for those reasons that you just shared about the online trolling and such. So here's the thing that's the poke. I feel like for some of us, we might think, oh, well, there's like levels of okayness. Like, okay, in Andie's child situation, maybe there was no other option. But what about the adoptees that literally go through the infant adoption process and are participating in the for-profit system, or choose to adopt also transnationally, so there's no chance that their adoptee's family will come knocking? And you know, like all of that, like there's like these levels of acceptability or not.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're saying.
Do you have thoughts on that? Because I feel like I have some thoughts on that, but I'm not sure if I should say them out loud, you know?
Yeah, I do exactly what you mean. Yeah, and I mean, full transparency, I think I skipped this part, and I did not skip this part on purpose. It's just when you're sitting here talking, your brain is running a million miles an hour. But we originally pursued, I did say that we had pursued infant adoption, but we pursued infant adoption enough that we did a fundraiser. And that's where it ended. Like, we did that fundraiser, and I actually canceled the fundraiser because inside me I was like, this is no bueno. And we ended up doing it because I felt there, like, literally the people at my church came to me and were like, no, we want to give you money for this. Of course you do. Of course you do. Anyway, so, you know, that is part of my experience. And I think it was because so much was happening in my life with the trauma work that it all just, that portion of my life stopped right there for the reasons of the commodification that comes into play. But I do want to go back. And first I want to say, like, I don't speak for anybody else's story but my own. But also, I have seen themes in speaking with other adoptees who adopt. I've seen a lot of common themes that, why? Because a lot of adoptees ask adoptees who adopt, why? Why would you do that? And what I see most of the time is that adoptees who have adopted, number one, are still very much in the view, the POV that adoption is love and adoption is helping. And adoption, like they had wonderful adoptions and they're grateful, which I validate those. Like I had great adoptive parents, not perfect, but so I can understand it where they're coming from. I did understand it at one point. I just told you that we are pursuing that type of adoption. But a lot of adoptees also will not challenge that idea, because to walk out of that is to break their safety net. Now I'm speaking as the therapist. A lot of adoptees cannot acknowledge that adoption is anything other than love, because then they would have to feel the feelings that they have been hiding, that they have been ignoring, that they have been storing in their hippocampus and their amygdala and have not allowed to enter the prefrontal cortex. It is a safety coping skill. And I really want people who are angry at us to hear that. It is a coping skill. Is it a good one? I don't know. But it's no different than any other coping skill. It was developed as a protection mechanism for their infant selves, their toddler selves, to feel safe in a situation where their body was telling them they weren't safe. That's basic trauma. It's not basic trauma. That's basic trauma lesson. So that's one aspect that I find on why adoptees adopt, is because they want to replicate that feeling. And if they can replicate what has occurred to them positively, then they can feel okay with what happened to them. That's what I've seen both online and in therapy. Now, another common theme I've seen is, I would say somewhat similar to mine, where who better to raise an adoptee than another adoptee? And I know a lot of people think that's a justification, but it's not. Because why are we all here? Why do we come on to podcasts? Why do we speak out against what happened to us? Because it hurt. And no other person is going to be able to see my child the way I see them as an adoptee, because I can. This happens daily. My husband cannot see things because he's not adopted, and we will be struggling in a normal child struggle and a normal daily thing that children get upset about. And I will say, that's not why they're mad. They're mad because, and he'll be like, how do you know that? I'll be like, because that's why I'm mad. And so again, it's not a justification for adopting, but going back to the river, who is better equipped than those of us who have been through it and done our own work? I think that's key. There are many people, adoptive parents, adopted or not, who haven't done their own work. And I think it's key that if you're an adoptee who's adopted, to really be self-aware and to have boundaries in your own life. There are certain points of parenting that I cannot do with our child. It is an open discussion. There's therapy involved for all parties. And so I think I put in the email to you, Haley, that I wanted to talk about, like, even if you've adopted as an adoptee, there's good things and there's bad things. There's still the both and. There are things that I can see things that no one else can, but there's also, I get triggered by things that no one else gets triggered by. And my child wound gets triggered by things that aren't their fault, but are simply, that happened to me. And now we're actively trying to parent it.
Well, when you were talking through some of those different reasons or the places where people come from, I remember talking to another adoptee who had adopted. She did adopted internationally. And she had already had adult children. And so now they were raising this adopted child together, her and her husband. And I asked her on 2 or 3 separate occasions, like if she felt any sort of differences in parenting or sort of, I was trying to get at that. And that question just never connected for her because I really think she literally didn't think of herself as an adoptive parent. Like she could not connect those two. And she was very outspoken and very critical of adoption and all of those things. And I was like, wow, you're really not putting it together.
Yeah. and I think that's so hard to, that's difficult. I think people hear, being an adoptee who has adopted, my primary lens will always be as an adoptee. That's my story. That's how I came to be. Like my brain formed as an adoptee. The trauma formed my brain. However, I am an adoptive parent. And, we talk about this in adoption all the time. With that comes a power dynamic that's uncomfortable for ourselves. It's uncomfortable for people around us. I would say there's a core group of us in the community, just like my online community, people I found who were pretty good at sitting in that both and, but we really struggle with adoptees hate us because we adopted. Adoptive parents hate us because we mirror to them how they need to parent, what they need to change. And we actively call them out and hold them accountable. And, first parents are uncomfortable with us because we're both. So I think it is hard to acknowledge that you're holding these 2 different titles, these 2 different roles. How do I daily I have to say, yes, I'm an adoptee, but the majority of my daily life has to be focusing on that I'm an adoptive parent. Because I'm raising a child. I'm responsible for that. I'm accountable for that. One day, my child's going to grow up, probably write an expose. You guys will all buy it. It's going to be great. I'm going to read it. I'm going to support my child. I'll be at the book signing, and it's going to tear me to pieces, I'm sure. But I can't wait for that day as well, because I want my child to be empowered I want them to be able to talk about that. And that's where I focus on. I'm the adoptive parent, and that's where I have to do the work. That's my job daily. But yeah, it's definitely hard to connect those pieces. I don't know if that answered the question or the poke you were going for.
Well, here's my last thing before we go into resources. And again, you don't have to answer for someone else's bad behavior. So I'm just going to give you a little story time. So
I love story time.
I used to co-host an adoptee support group, and it's still going. My friends are running it, but I just didn't have capacity anymore. And it was an Adoptees Connect group. So you always start out, you give the we keep things confidential, all the support group things, right? If you're a member of more than one part of the constellation, this group is for your adoptee hat only, right? Adult adoptee support. So groups are confidential. I'm going to share this part of the story because this person broke confidentiality. So this person came to the group also as an adoptive parent, and she came looking for support parenting her child. And that is not the point of the group. And so 2 or 3 times I had to say, okay, but we're put our adoptee hats on like this. We are not helping to give advice kind of thing. Anyway, so they left the group having had a really terrible experience because they came for parenting advice, not as an adopted person. They came as an adoptive parent. And so now this person publicly shares on all these podcasts about these angry adoptees and how we traumatized her and we told her we all wish we had been aborted and just all of these things that like fake news. That is not what happened.
Yeah.
And so when you say we all need to do our own work, I mean, that is the kind of person who's out there teaching other adoptive parents how to parent their child when they clearly have not done their own work or somehow delusional because that is not the event that occurred. So what are we supposed to do with that? What are we supposed to do with that, Andie?
I don't know. I think I can understand, like I said, I can understand adoptees who hate me and first parents. Like, I get it. I can understand. I gained from adoption. I hold the power dynamic. I have a very difficult time, and this is my humanity showing, understanding adoptees who adopt who aren't doing their work. How do you wake up in the morning? Like, I know this sounds so, this is not my therapist hat. But truly, this is my human hat. How are you, like, how can you parent an adoptee, being an adoptee yourself without doing your work? You're actively choosing to hurt your own community and your child's community. I do this work both in my in therapy myself. I do this work in my home, as my business, as my job, because I am accountable to a child in my home, and I want to make it better. How? I don't know how to answer that question because I don't know what to do with that. Because I don't know how they cannot.
Well, here's something that I'll share that I really respect about you. Because I also know that woman's child's story. I could write a book about it because of how much she's disclosed. And she'll say things like, we're not allowed to tell our child's story. You know, we have to keep them private. And then goes on to spill all the tea. Like,
oh, that's
right?
My favorite.
Yeah. So, but you have, I hope, demonstrated to folks like you can hold back personal details of something that is not your own. I hope you're modeling for people. I think you are. I think you're modeling the way and the both and like sitting in it. Like it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for me to talk about with you that you adopted. In my head, I'm like, oh my gosh, I wish we had another hour. Like, what do you think about abolition? Like you are part of the foster care system and like why, like without getting to story, like,
oh, I got opinions.
Yeah, why is there even someone out there that says that parent can't parent this child properly according to the state?
Who decides
right?
that?
Who decides that? So I know
I know who decides it. I've seen them do it, and I'm like, why are you the person? Why did we? Who said you were like you? You have a hard time getting your car oil changed. Why are you deciding who stays and who goes?
But I think one of the most helpful things that you shared today is something that you kind of wrote a little bit about on one of your Instagram posts. You said, somewhere deep within myself, I subconsciously believed if I became the rescuer, then I could fix that wound within myself. And not to psychoanalyze every single person who's adopted, but I think there's a real ring of truth to that for many.
Yes.
So I don't know, bringing that to light hopefully will help. Y'all stop bullying. Stop sending these harassing messages. Like it's done. It's done. Like I don't understand.
Yeah. I think that I wish every day that my adoption had never occurred. I wish every day that my child's adoption had never occurred. It shouldn't be this way. I think we hear that phrase a lot in adoption in this community. It should not be this way. And that makes me angry. I'm an angry adoptee. I don't know if you guys know this, but adoptees can be angry, and it can be healthy. Um, Anger is healthy. So when people call me an angry adoptee, I'm like, thank you. That means a lot to me. Anyway, I think that right now, why I'm here on this podcast, knowing that both you and I will get flack, knowing there will be both positive and very negative feedback, is because there is not a space for adoptees who adopted to wrestle that, to deal with that. There's not a space for potential adoptive parents who are adoptees to sit and feel comfortable talking about it. That's why I'm here today, is because we need to talk about it. We need to create that space so that adoptees can answer that question before more harm is done, so that we can say, without having to hide in the shadows, because so many of us do. Like you said, I don't think there's a week that goes by that somebody doesn't message me and say, I'm an adoptee, but I also adopted. I'm scared to let people know. And they have every right to be. I have been called disgusting. I have been called evil. I have received death threats. I have received threats to find me and my family so somebody can take my child and save them from me. That's not okay. And that's why I'm here, is because I want there to be a space for adoptees who are either considering adoption, considering foster care, have already done it, to answer that question within themselves, to face that reality of the quote that you just shared. Because I think if we're going to create change, if we're going to pursue abolition and adoption, if we're going to rewrite the system, if we're going to, fix it, it's going to take every single one of us.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing with us, and it's heavy. Even as you said those things, I was like, oh no, but they shouldn't be considering adoption. Just like, right. So, like in my head, I'm like, oh no, but we're not doing that anymore. So we all have very different views, but we can be civil. And look, we had a whole conversation. I've talked before, like, we could do it. It's possible. It's
not easy.
No, it's not.
It is not easy. And it definitely triggers us. Like, I know full well after this, I'm going to go, I don't know, take a nap or something, whatever my body decides I was going to process the trauma triggers.
When I post the social on this, I'm going to feel unwell. So hopefully y'all just behave yourselves. Please, if you disagree, I don't need to know about it. Neither does Andie, frankly. Okay, let's talk about our recommended resources. So I have learned so much from your Instagram. You are one of my favorite follows. I don't know if people know this, but on Adoptees On, like, I follow quite a few accounts, but I don't really check too often because I never want to replicate or steal someone's work inadvertently. It's kind of one of those things. That's why I don't really watch too much. But if I see an Andie story, click.
Well, let's be honest. There's a lot more humor than there is education sometimes.
Oh my gosh. That's the best part. So anyway, if you're not following, you got to make sure you follow. And there is a lot of education. And for those of us who are not interested in talking to adoptive parents or teaching them anything, you're picking up a lot of that slack and taking that on and really doing work that I literally cannot. I have rules on my page. I don't engage because it's not for me. So I'm really thankful for people like you who are able to sit in the booth and teach people what they need to know, call them out on what they need to be called out on, etc.
That's always a fun time.
But the other cool thing that you're a part of, and I actually have, you're not gonna be able to see them, but the post resource boxes. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
So post resource, oh gosh, there's so many ways I could describe it, or it came together. How it started was I met this lady online, Claire. she her handles Project Dawn, another adoptee, and we got to know each other online. And one day, we had not met yet, I got this text, and she's like, "We're going to do this thing," and I'm like, "I don't want to do this thing. I don't have the energy for it." That's how I felt internally. I feel like that still some days, especially like as we're pushing to get things done. But in a matter of 15 minutes, we developed this idea, and it literally only took 15 minutes because it's exactly what we needed as kids. And it is a business. We're very upfront about that because you're going to pay us for our work and our lived experience. And, I got a degree. We're very upfront about that. We are not a nonprofit. We don't give these things out for free, but it's a connection. We started with this connection box, and the connection box is this gorgeous box that we designed and had made. And it's a physical object that an adoptee or foster youth can have and hold and put in things that are important to them, that they have, relating to their adoption or anything that's just important to them. The idea being then we just started a subscription service where we provide the adoptive parents literal templates and activities with step-by-step how-tos based on age development and abilities that they can either share with biological first parents. It creates the relationship where we're learning about each other, we're sharing things. If you're in an open adoption, you send these back and forth. Adoptive parents pay for everything. They send it or send the link with our subscription service. It's all downloadable. We specifically designed this for every single type of adoption and foster care and kinship placement and guardianship. It is applicable to adult adoptees, to former foster youth. And really what it does is if it's an open adoption, it encourages that connection because we believe connected families are stronger families. That's literally our motto. If you are in a closed adoption, it is a tool that adoptive parents can use to help encourage the adoptee to develop their identity, to process. We created it so therapists can take it and use it in therapy room to, again, help with identity processing and developing like life storybooks. So it can be used in so many different ways. And we, with our subscription, we've adjusted all of the wording and all of the instructions so you don't have an excuse. We hear a lot that adoptive parents are like, "Oh, well, I don't have this tool. I don't have that resource. I grew up in the 80s. We didn't have anything." We're literally making this so that 20 years from now, if an adoptive parent says that, we can say, no, it was there and it was there. So it's a no excuse tool for adoptive parents, foster parents, guardians, kinship to create that relationship, to do the work. We provide journal entries and education that continue to educate and challenge the adoptive parents. And we provide tools and activities for the kids and or adopted people to continue to process their identities.
I bought them when you first launched them to support adoptee business. And I'm keeping all of my adoption paperwork and genealogy history that I've printed off and emails I've printed off from both sides. It's sort of like my treasure box. So that's how I'm using it. Yeah.
That's kind of what we wanted it to be, a treasure box. We specifically designed its look so that it could be on your bookshelf and you wouldn't really know what it was, because we do know a lot of first parents don't have the safety to share that part of their story. And a lot of adoptees don't either. And so we wanted it to be something that was gorgeous and beautiful and honored their story, but also was safe to be able to use just like that.
Lovely. Okay, so where can we find those and where can we connect with you online?
You can post resource is just postresource.com. You can read more about us. There's a way better explanation than what I just gave because I tend to get too wordy when I'm talking on podcasts. You can always email us. There's a link to contact us if you have any questions. We also do something at Post Resource called sponsorships, where if you're any part of the constellation and you want to provide that for someone who can't afford it, we do not ask adoptees or first parents to pay. We want to be able to one day be working with agencies so that all of this comes, free to the adoptee and to the first parent, because it should not cost us, should not cost them. So you can do a sponsorship, and we have a list of people waiting, and we will send them the whole kit. So if you have any questions, there's a way to contact us there. I can be found at andieinc.com or Andie Inc. on Instagram.
Perfect. And if you want to hear more from Andie talking about trauma and those kinds of things, you have one season of a podcast called Trauma Informed Everything. We'll link to that. Mm-hmm. And you've got so much of your writing and work is available online and linked on your website. So hopefully folks will check that out. Thanks so much for sharing with me. And I really appreciate talking about something really difficult with you. Thank you for spending your resources talking about it.
I'd like to say it was a pleasure.
Really? Which part? When I told this story about the adoptive parent who was slandering me online, that part.
Oh my gosh. People. Anyway, that's why I became a therapist. But I think, I want to just say thank you to the people who did make it this far in the podcast. I know that this is an easy topic. I know that there are, where you live in a society that wants like black and white answers. It doesn't come often in adoption. And I'm sorry that I can't give black and white answers. I wish I could. And I know that any answers I give to some people are going to sound like excuses, and I acknowledge that. They're going to sound like justification. I acknowledge that. So thanks, Haley, for sitting through it. I know it wasn't easy for you either. It's a pleasure, right? It's a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Can't wait. Thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you, Andie. Andie and I chatted a little bit after our conversation here that was on the record, and she let me know that she will be announcing in the future a possibility of a community for adoptees who are also adoptive parents. So if that is of interest to you, make sure you're following her on Instagram, and she will put updates up there as it's available. This was a hard one, and it's one of those episodes that I am going to feel a little nervous when it goes live. I think talking about the complexities of this, it's very easy for me to sit here and say adoption is never the right thing to do when I have absolutely no experience personally with children that need permanence. And I am really, really hopeful that as more of us advocate for family preservation and kinship care and the importance of legal guardianship and access to our original records and identity preservation, meaning that our birth certificates are not altered in any way, that there is no secrecy about our genetic origins. I think the more times and ways we're able to advocate for those and are successful, that is the way we want to move forward, in my personal opinion. And I think probably there are a lot of folks that would agree with that. And I don't know in the time we're recording this in 2023, if that is too idealistic. I don't know, because I don't have personal experience with how all the systems work. The other piece that we really didn't get into, we just briefly mentioned, was the abolitionist movement, and with specifically in regards to the foster care system, or as the abolitionist groups may call it, the family policing system. And if you're not familiar with those terms, I hope that you will do some looking around, Google, and read some books on the topic, because I think there's a lot we can learn from the abolitionist movement. And so many groups have very, very strong opinions about participating in the system at this time detracts from the abolitionist movement, right? So once again, we're back in the gray. So I look forward to learning more about this in the future, and also being mindful for myself that talking to adoptive parents is hard. But once they become your friends and you see them and you see the heart behind it, and you see we tried to do all the ethical things and it's a lot easier to see the other side. So I don't know. Am I talking out of both sides of my mouth? Believe me, I see it, and I see the complexity, and I still hope there are no more adopted people created in this world, because I don't wish the pain of being separated from our original families on anyone. And yet there are very, very, very few cases where children need to be protected. And I think that's the way, that's the argument so many people will come to. And it is such a tiny percentage of adoption situations present day. So I will keep that in mind too. All right, my friend, thank you for engaging in this, really looking critically at adoption from an adopted person's perspective. And yeah, go out there and be a good human on the internet. Thank you for listening. Next week, we are going to have the start, part 1 of a 2-part, back-to-back, very, very exciting interview with Deanna Schroeds. I can't wait to share it. Her story is amazing. So come back next week for part 1 of my 2-part interview with Deanna Schroeds. And thanks for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.